Hi, I'm Marina Endicott. My book, The Difference, has been shortlisted for the Jim Connors Dartmouth Book Award for Fiction. I wish that I could be in Nova Scotia in real life, but virtually is second best. I'm going to read to you from the middle of the book, from what might be called the inciting incident. The Morning Light, a ship sailing out of Yarmouth in 1911, is now north of Papua New Guinea in the middle of Micronesia, sailing towards Shanghai. 12-year-old Kay and her half-sister, Thea, who's almost 20 years older, have seen a wilder country all these last few days, with fires along the shore and many boats of people coming out wanting to sell fruit and woven mats. About 4 p.m, Thea was walking with Francis along the port side when he sighted a small island that on inspection of the map turned out to be Pulo Ana, or Ana Island, half a mile in circumference. Thea never wearied of seeing an island on a map and looking up to see it in reality lying before them. While the morning light was still about 10 miles out, they saw 2 boats coming off, full of men. Looking up from his map, Francis told Thea they must want something pretty badly because it was already growing dark and looked like squalls. The boats came up alongside and hailed. After taking a look at the men and exchanging a few words, Francis let them come on board. They all came, perhaps 20 of them. The poor things looked to be almost starving. They didn't have a morsel of food in their boats to sell, nothing but mats, splendid fishing lines, and shells. The men said they were poor, poor, and repeated it, pointing to their stomachs. Among them was a young boy, 7 or 8, or perhaps older, but not large. He stood bravely on the deck, a little man already, with a clear, interested eye to all about him. When he raised his hand to Thea, she caught it, and their hands clasped, neither larger than the other. He was truly very thin. She turned the little hand over in her own, touching the strong knuckle bones, and looked into his eyes. He looked back into her own and seemed to find pleasure in the exchange, for he smiled with affectionate welcome. She went down to ask the cook to bring up bread. The men ate and ate, and more was brought up until they had downed a bushel of bread between them. Thea took the boy on her lap to feed him, since he did not push forward to ask for a piece, and she feared there might be none remaining. His knees were too large on his skinny legs, and the fine skin stretched taut over them. So young, but wide awake to the world, too. Sitting tranquil on her knee, he ate the bread neatly, and when she smiled to reassure him, he smiled in companionship again. Not a baby anymore, but a person already. He had a quality of stillness, of attention, that surprised and touched her. She touched his forehead, and he laid his head back to rest on her shoulder. The men spread out their wares before her and showed fine shells to tempt Kay, too. They would take nothing for their mats but tobacco, the only other word they knew besides poor. Mr. Best brought up what they had to trade, setting up the tins in a short pyramid that made the men shout in appreciation. Tobacco, tobacco, repeated the thin-legged man who was the leader, whom the others, when he shouted to them to back him up, called the king. They were crazy for tobacco, mad for it. Several of them spoke to the king, and he turned to Thea and pointed at the boy on her knee, and then with 4 fingers at the tins of tobacco, and then to the boy again. Francis said, "He's offering to sell you the boy, my love." Thea looked at him and then at the king. "Ask and you shall have. Seek and you shall find." Everyone was quiet. 4 pounds of tobacco for this boy, she asked the king. He nodded, and the men beside him nodded too. The other men rustled among themselves and pushed forward a couple of other younger fellows, but Francis waved them back. "No, no," he said, "I have no need of crewmen." It seemed to Thea that all the men would have stayed on board if they could have. They must have been near the end of their resources, so many of them, and such a small island to support them. What could their lives be like? She looked at Francis again, one arm still around the boy on her knee. "I can probably get them down to 2 pounds of tobacco," he murmured. She shook her head. "4 it is then," Francis said. He pushed the cans across the deck with his foot. Kay had backed away from the shell sellers, a little afraid of their hunger. She watched this bargaining unfold from the shadow of the lifeboat. It did not feel. She thought that there was something wrong here, some misunderstanding from the lack of common language. It gave her a dizzy feeling to hear Thea say that. 4 pounds of tobacco for this boy. Confused, Kay watched the men agreeing, and she watched the boy. What would Mr. Brimner say to this? From his canvas nest above her, the old Tongan sailor Seaton muttered, "Many worse lives than a boy on a decent ship." The boy slid from Thea's knee and stood patiently on the white, clean deck, waiting to go home. He was so young, looking about him, not knowing. Once the deal was done, the men left the ship, going past the boy one by one, rubbing noses with him. Kay had heard it called that, but it was a wrong expression, for what they did was press their faces to his face, soft and deep. Forehead to forehead, they looked into the boy's eyes and clasped his arms. The last of the men pressed his face into the boy's face over and over, not wanting to go, so that Kay thought he must be the boy's father or perhaps his older brother. It was hard to tell how old the people were. Thea held out another can of tobacco urgently. "For the boy's mother," she said, and Kay ran to the side and handed it down into the canoe. The king man took it. Kay pointed back and shouted, "For his mama," but did not know if the man understood her. They settled to their paddles and oars and set off back to the island. It was almost twilight. Mr. Best brought up a washtub with fresh water, and by lantern light they stripped the boy and put him in the bath. Mr. Bright held him while Mr. Best cut his hair short so it would not be so tangled. The boy made no protest or cry, but submitted peaceably to whatever was done to him. He kept his eyes on Thea while it was done. The boy was put into a white shirt and the smallest pair of trousers from the store of crew clothing, still much too big, and set down barefoot upon the scrubbed planks of the deck. He looked around, intently examining everything he saw, up in the ropes as well as around at all the people, shadowy in the torchlight. Then he cupped his hands over his eyes and stood very still. Thank you very much. Goodbye to Nova Scotia.